The capture and transfer of German prisoners of war to the United States was one of the largest and most complex military logistics operations of the Second World War. Between 1942 and 1945, over 370,000 German POWs were held on American soil. Most were captured on the battlefields of North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe, then transported thousands of miles across the Atlantic Ocean under the authority of the U.S. Army's Provost Marshal General's Office. The process began in North Africa following Operation Torch in November 1942, when Allied forces invaded French North Africa and confronted the German Afrika Korps under General Erwin Rommel. After the Axis defeat in Tunisia in May 1943, approximately 275,000 Axis soldiers, including around 150,000 Germans, were taken prisoner. The British, already strained by the number of captives from previous campaigns, lacked the capacity to house and feed such a massive influx. The United States, which had more resources and geographic distance from the front lines, agreed to accept tens of thousands of these prisoners for internment in camps across its mainland. Captured soldiers were initially gathered in temporary holding areas near the battlefields. They were processed, disarmed, and questioned under the supervision of the Allied military police. The Geneva Convention of 1929 mandated humane treatment of prisoners, and the U.S. military aimed to adhere strictly to it, partly to ensure reciprocal treatment of American prisoners of war in German hands. Each prisoner underwent registration, was assigned a serial number, and had personal details recorded. Transportation from North Africa to America involved multiple stages. Prisoners were first shipped to staging areas such as Oran, Algiers, and Casablanca, where they waited for available vessels. Due to the U-boat threat in the Atlantic, convoys carrying POWs were heavily guarded. Most were transported aboard Liberty ships or converted troop ships. The voyage typically lasted 2 to 3 weeks, depending on convoy routes and naval conditions. Prisoners were kept below deck in secured compartments. Sanitation was basic but regulated, with scheduled times for meals and limited deck exercise when permitted. Security on these ships was tight, but discipline among the German prisoners was generally strong. The majority of them were Wehrmacht soldiers who obeyed orders and understood that resistance at sea would be futile. American guards were instructed to maintain control without unnecessary violence. Medical officers were present on most voyages to treat illness and monitor hygiene. The mortality rate during transport remained low compared to the massive movements of prisoners elsewhere in the war. Upon arrival in the United States, most POWs disembarked at major ports such as Norfolk, Virginia, New York City, Newport News, and Boston on the East Coast, or at Gulf Coast ports like New Orleans and Houston. From these ports, they were transferred to regional processing centers run by the U.S. Army. The camps at Fort Meade, Maryland, Fort Bliss, Texas, and Camp Shanks, New York, served as key distribution points. Prisoners were deloused, issued new clothing marked PW, and given medical examinations. They were then assigned to one of hundreds of permanent camps across the country. The locations of POW camps were chosen for security, logistical convenience, and the availability of agricultural or industrial labor nearby. Camps were established in nearly every state, with large concentrations in Texas, Oklahoma, and the Midwest. The U.S. government saw practical advantage in distributing the prisoners widely. The prisoners could supplement labor shortages caused by wartime enlistment, especially in agriculture and forestry, while being securely housed far from war zones. Before they reached the camps, however, most German soldiers were still uncertain about their fate. Nazi propaganda had long claimed that Allied forces, especially the Americans and Soviets, tortured or executed prisoners. Many captured Germans expected severe punishment or starvation. These fears were reinforced by stories spread within the ranks of the Wehrmacht that Americans were ruthless toward captured enemies. When the first groups arrived in American ports, their apprehension was visible. Guards reported that prisoners were quiet, disciplined, and wary. However, the initial processing contradicted their expectations. They were provided food, medical care, and access to mail services under the supervision of the International Red Cross. American authorities were aware that compliance with the Geneva Convention would be closely monitored and saw humane treatment as both a moral and strategic imperative. The logistical challenge of housing tens of thousands of prisoners required rapid organization. By late 1943, the War Department had established the Prisoner of War branch within the Provost Marshal General's office to oversee all aspects of the POW system. This office coordinated construction, transport, food supply, and labor arrangements. Camp construction followed standardized blueprints: barracks, mess halls, recreation fields, hospitals, and perimeter fences with guard towers. The typical camp housed between 3,000 and 5,000 prisoners, guarded by a combination of Army personnel and civilian employees. Transport from ports to inland camps was typically carried out by train under military escort. Prisoners were grouped according to rank to comply with international regulations. Officers were separated from enlisted men and sent to special camps like Camp Crossville in Tennessee and Camp Clinton in Mississippi. Non-commissioned and enlisted soldiers were distributed among work camps, where they could be employed in non-military labor. American citizens in areas near POW camps were often surprised by the arrival of German soldiers in their communities. Local newspapers covered their arrival, sometimes with concern, but often with curiosity. The government maintained strict rules about interactions between civilians and prisoners, but local economies benefited from the use of POW labor in farming and lumber industries. For the prisoners, the first weeks in America were marked by adjustment and disbelief. Instead of the brutal imprisonment they had feared, they encountered a system that emphasized order, fairness, and discipline. Meals were substantial and regular, following nutritional standards similar to those of U.S. troops. Medical services were available to all prisoners, and Red Cross inspections were permitted. This treatment was not solely humanitarian. U.S. officials believed that adherence to the Geneva Convention would encourage similar treatment for American POWs held by Germany. Although this expectation was only partially fulfilled, moreover, officials recognized that good treatment of POWs could serve as an ideological weapon against Nazism, showing the contrast between totalitarian cruelty and democratic fairness. While conditions were generally good, not all transfers were smooth. Some voyages experienced overcrowding, seasickness, and shortages of supplies. On rare occasions, U-boat attacks forced convoys to reroute or delay. There were isolated incidents of unrest, though discipline remained high among most prisoners. The overall mortality rate among German POWs in U.S. custody, including during transport, was below 1%, among the lowest of any nation holding foreign captives in World War II. The majority of the prisoners came from regular army divisions rather than the SS, although members of the latter were also captured and segregated due to their ideological fervor. Regular Wehrmacht soldiers were more likely to adapt to the rules and maintain cooperative relations with American guards. The U.S. Army required guards to treat all prisoners according to uniform standards, avoiding favoritism or punitive measures unless provoked. As the war progressed, new groups of prisoners continued to arrive from the European theater. After the D-Day landings in June 1944, the number of captured Germans increased dramatically. Many were shipped from England or France to the United States, joining those who had come earlier from North Africa. By early 1945, there were more than 400 main camps and several hundred smaller branch camps operating under the U.S. Army's supervision. The American public's perception of these prisoners evolved over time. Early suspicion gave way to a sense of pragmatic acceptance as it became clear that POWs contributed valuable labor and were securely contained. For the German soldiers, the contrast between expectations and reality grew sharper with each passing week. They had anticipated physical abuse or deprivation, but instead they found structured routines, adequate food, and relative safety. Letters home were censored but permitted, allowing prisoners to communicate their experiences. Many wrote that they were surprised by the humane treatment and by the abundance of food compared to wartime shortages in Germany. Reports later compiled by the U.S. Office of War Information indicated that these letters had a psychological effect on German morale, undermining the Nazi portrayal of America as a cruel and lawless enemy. By the end of 1945, the transatlantic transport of prisoners had become a routine military operation. Ships regularly moved POWs from European ports to the United States and back again as repatriation began. The process had demonstrated the organizational capacity of the U.S. military and the logistical reach of the Allied war effort. The initial capture and transportation of German soldiers to the United States marked the beginning of an experience that defied their expectations. They entered captivity prepared for brutality and humiliation, but instead found a system that balanced strict control with humane conditions. This early phase of their journey set the tone for the years that followed, shaping the way many would later describe their time in America as one of the most surprising aspects of their wartime lives. Once German prisoners of war completed their transport from ports and were distributed across the United States, they entered a system that had been developed with precision by the U.S. Army and the War Department. The internment of German POWs became one of the most extensive operations of domestic wartime management in American history. At its peak, the United States operated more than 400 base camps and roughly 500 branch camps that extended across nearly every state. The structure and operation of these facilities were shaped by the Geneva Convention of 1929, which outlined the international standards for the humane treatment of prisoners. The U.S. military followed these regulations closely, aware that their adherence would reflect on the country's moral standing and diplomatic credibility. The Provost Marshal General's office was responsible for all aspects of POW administration, from camp construction to food, labor, and discipline. Each camp functioned as a miniature military installation under Army command, with detailed rules governing every area of prisoner life. The physical construction of the camps followed standardized blueprints designed by the Army Corps of Engineers. Most were built quickly between 1942 and 1944, often on existing military property or leased farmland. The perimeter was enclosed by double fences topped with barbed wire and monitored by guard towers equipped with searchlights. Inside, the layout typically included rows of wooden barracks, a mess hall, infirmary, recreation field, chapel, and administrative buildings. Each camp maintained separate sections for officers and enlisted personnel, consistent with Geneva requirements. The barracks were basic but adequate for the climate. Each wooden building usually housed between 40 and 60 men. Interior furnishings consisted of double bunks, potbelly stoves, tables, and lockers. Electricity and heating were provided, though fuel supplies were rationed. In the southern states, ventilation was prioritized to combat heat, while in northern areas, insulation and coal heating were essential during winter. Camp maintenance and cleanliness were the responsibility of the prisoners themselves, organized under appointed non-commissioned officers. The administration of the camps relied heavily on a dual system. American officers handled overall command and security, while German prisoners managed internal discipline and daily operations. This self-administration reduced friction and helped maintain order. Each camp had a designated camp spokesman chosen by the prisoners, approved by U.S. authorities, who acted as a liaison with the American commandant. This structure mirrored German military organization and preserved a sense of hierarchy among the prisoners, which American officials found useful for maintaining discipline. Food standards within the camps were set to match those of U.S. Army soldiers, as stipulated by the Geneva Convention. Menus varied by region, but were nutritionally balanced and considerably better than what civilians were eating in war-torn Europe. Typical meals included meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and coffee, with occasional desserts. In agricultural areas, surplus farm produce often supplemented rations. Red Cross inspectors verified that food standards were maintained. Many German prisoners later stated that the quantity and quality of the food were beyond what they expected or had received even during peacetime in Germany. Medical care was also consistent with U.S. military standards. Each base camp maintained a hospital staffed by American and German medical personnel. Prisoner doctors and nurses were allowed to practice under supervision, and Red Cross supplies ensured access to necessary medications. Epidemics were rare due to strict hygiene regulations. The U.S. Army's Surgeon General's office regularly inspected medical facilities to ensure compliance with international law. Serious cases requiring specialized treatment were transferred to nearby civilian or military hospitals. Religious services were permitted and often encouraged. Protestant, Catholic, and in some cases, Lutheran chaplains among the prisoners conducted worship under the oversight of Army chaplains. The War Department saw this as a stabilizing factor in camp morale. Religious holidays were observed, including Christmas, during which prisoners were sometimes allowed to decorate barracks and receive small parcels from families through the Red Cross. Cultural and educational activities developed quickly within the camp system. The U.S. authorities believed that structured recreation reduced disciplinary problems and helped occupy prisoners during long internments. Libraries were established with books in German and English. Many camps organized classes in mathematics, engineering, English language, and agriculture. American educators, often local teachers or professors, volunteered to teach, while German officers provided academic instruction. Some prisoners used their time to complete technical or trade education that later proved useful after the war. Recreation included organized sports, theater, and music. Soccer and volleyball were especially popular. Camps often held tournaments between barracks or even against local American teams under supervision. Musical groups formed spontaneously, performing German folk songs and classical pieces with instruments supplied by the YMCA and Red Cross. These activities, while seemingly minor, contributed to maintaining discipline and morale among the prisoners. The psychological environment in the camps evolved as prisoners realized the consistency of humane treatment. Early suspicion gave way to routine adaptation. American guards were instructed not to fraternize excessively, but to treat prisoners with fairness. Most guards were older soldiers or those assigned to domestic duty due to medical reasons. They enforced regulations, but were not encouraged to show hostility. Isolated incidents of conflict occurred, but systematic abuse was rare. The War Department maintained a clear policy that violations of the Geneva Convention by guards would result in disciplinary action. Labor formed a major component of POW life. Under international law, enlisted men could be required to perform non-military labor, provided it did not involve war production. The U.S. government used this provision to address domestic labor shortages. Prisoners were employed in agriculture, forestry, canning, construction, and maintenance. They were paid in script tokens redeemable at camp canteen and zabuts, as direct cash payment was prohibited. The average wage was 80 cents per day, part of which was used to support the cost of the POW program. Branch camps were established near work sites, especially during harvest seasons. Prisoners were transported daily under guard to farms or factories. American employers could not directly hire or pay them. They paid the War Department, which then issued the prisoners' script pay. Farmers in the Midwest and South often depended heavily on POW labor during 1944 and 1945. Reports indicated high productivity and generally cooperative attitudes from the German workers, many of whom viewed the labor as preferable to idleness. Despite overall good conditions, tensions sometimes arose within the camps due to ideological divisions among the prisoners. Devout Nazis, known as true believers, clashed with those who were indifferent or disillusioned with the regime. The U.S. Army began separating known Nazi activists into special camps to prevent intimidation and propaganda among the general prisoner population. At Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and Camp Alva, Oklahoma, the most committed Nazi prisoners were concentrated under stricter supervision. This segregation policy reduced internal violence and political agitation. Inspections by the International Committee of the Red Cross provided an additional layer of accountability. Representatives visited camps regularly, interviewed prisoners privately, and reported on conditions. These reports were shared with both the German government and the protecting power representing German interests, initially Switzerland. U.S. authorities took these inspections seriously and made improvements based on the recommendations. The consistent oversight reinforced the perception among prisoners that American treatment adhered strictly to international law. Mail and communication with families were permitted under regulated channels. Each prisoner could send 2 letters and 4 postcards per month. The correspondence passed through censorship offices but allowed genuine personal contact. Packages from families were limited due to wartime shortages, but the Red Cross provided standard parcels containing soap, cigarettes, chocolate, and toiletries. These small connections with home were significant for morale and further demonstrated to prisoners that they were not cut off from the outside world. Camp discipline was firm but predictable. The U.S. Army applied its own military code to maintain order. Infractions such as attempted escape, insubordination, or theft resulted in confinement or loss of privileges. Escape attempts were relatively few compared to other theaters of war. Some prisoners tested security by cutting fences or disappearing briefly, but were usually recaptured without violence. Punishments were proportionate and documented, in compliance with Geneva rules. Daily life in the camps followed a consistent schedule. Prisoners rose early for roll call, ate breakfast, and proceeded to assigned duties or classes. Work details lasted until late afternoon, followed by free time for sports, study, or correspondence. Lights out regulations were enforced at night. Inspections ensured cleanliness and order. Medical checks were regular, and sanitation standards were maintained through strict cleaning routines. The economic impact of the POW system on local communities was notable. Towns near large camps benefited from the purchase of supplies and from the use of POW labor in critical industries. Local attitudes toward the prisoners softened over time as residents observed their orderly conduct. Many Americans were surprised by the politeness and discipline of the German soldiers. Community relations improved to the point that some civilians developed limited but cordial contact through supervised work programs. The cost of maintaining the POW program was substantial, but justified as a wartime necessity. By 1945, the U.S. government had spent hundreds of millions of dollars on camp construction, food, and administration. However, The productivity of prisoner labor offset much of this expense. The War Department calculated that POW work contributed millions of man-hours to the American economy, especially in agriculture and lumber production, where labor shortages were acute. The combination of order, adequate nutrition, medical care, and productive activity made life in American captivity radically different from what most German soldiers had expected. Their experience contrasted sharply with conditions in many European theaters, where shortages, overcrowding, and violence were common. For many of these men, American internment became a period of stability amid the collapse of their homeland. By late 1944, the POW camp system had reached full maturity. Administrative efficiency, consistent standards, and clear discipline produced a controlled yet humane environment. This foundation allowed the U.S. Army to later implement reeducation and ideological programs aimed at influencing the prisoners' post-war attitudes, which would become a defining feature of their experience in captivity. The structure and daily operations of these camps demonstrated the United States' commitment to lawful conduct even during total war. The system's success lay in its balance between strict security and respect for human rights. For the German prisoners, it represented a daily contradiction to the propaganda they had once believed. As the POW camp system across the United States stabilized, the daily life of German prisoners took on a structured and predictable rhythm. By 1944, most camps operated at full efficiency, providing a controlled yet humane environment that combined labor, routine, and limited recreation. Within this framework, prisoners adapted to a way of life that many later described as surprisingly comfortable when compared to wartime conditions in Europe. Work was the central component of captivity for enlisted German soldiers. Under Article 27 of the 1929 Geneva Convention, prisoners of war could be required to perform labor not directly connected with military operations. The U.S. Army utilized this clause to address nationwide labor shortages caused by the enlistment of millions of American men. Agriculture, forestry, and food processing industries were the main sectors that absorbed POW labor. The War Manpower Commission coordinated with the Provost Marshal General's office to assign prisoners to labor detachments. Base camps functioned as administrative hubs, while branch camps were established near work sites such as farms, sawmills, canneries, and construction projects. The system was extensive. By 1945, more than 1,000 branch camps operated temporarily across the country, from Maine to California. Each work detail was accompanied by guards and supervised by civilian or Army personnel. A standard workday lasted 8 to 10 hours, excluding transportation time. Prisoners were required to report for roll call before sunrise, receive their assigned tools, and board military trucks for the journey to work locations. At agricultural sites, tasks included planting, harvesting, and sorting crops. In lumber operations, they felled trees, cut timber, and loaded freight cars. Canneries employed POWs in cleaning, sealing, and labeling production lines. All work was non-military in nature, carefully monitored to comply with international law. Wages for German POWs were standardized. The official rate set by the War Department in 1943 was 80 cents per day, divided between direct credit to the prisoner's camp account and a deduction used to cover government expenses. Payment was made in canteen coupons or camp script, which could be exchanged for goods in the camp store. Prisoners could purchase tobacco, toiletries, stationery, and limited food items such as candy or fruit. Direct cash transactions were prohibited to prevent economic influence on local communities. The system created a limited but functioning camp economy. Prisoners organized bartering networks for cigarettes, canned food, and personal items. Some used their wages to buy art supplies or materials for hobbies permitted by camp authorities. These microeconomies remained under strict supervision, but helped sustain morale and reduced idleness. The American approach to food remained consistent with earlier standards, but became a defining feature of the prisoners' experience. The War Department's subsistence branch provided rations equivalent in caloric value to those of U.S. troops stationed domestically. Menus typically featured meat several times a week, fresh vegetables, bread, and coffee. In regions with local produce, meals were supplemented by fruit and dairy. Breakfasts often included eggs or oatmeal, while dinners featured beef, chicken, or pork with potatoes. Desserts such as pudding or ice cream were occasionally served, particularly during holidays. In many oral histories collected after the war, German prisoners recalled their astonishment at the quantity and regularity of American meals. Food shortages in Germany had already begun by 1943, and many soldiers had subsisted on reduced rations at the front. For them, the abundance of food in American camps symbolized an unexpected level of care. This contrast led to the common remark among prisoners that they were being fed like kings. Camp kitchens were staffed by both American personnel and selected German cooks. Prisoners with culinary training from civilian life were often assigned to kitchen duty. Menus were approved by the camp quartermaster, and Red Cross inspectors periodically reviewed food preparation. Leftovers were managed to prevent waste, and sanitation rules were enforced through daily inspections. Labor efficiency and good nutrition were interdependent. American officers noted that well-fed prisoners were more productive and cooperative. Reports submitted to the Provost Marshal General's office in 1944 documented that POW labor output often equaled or exceeded that of civilian replacements, particularly in farm work where discipline and stamina were valued. Daily schedules in the camps followed strict order. Prisoners were awakened by bugle or bell between 5:30 and 6 a.m. Morning roll call was mandatory and conducted by both German and American non-commissioned officers. After breakfast, work details were assembled and assignments verified. Prisoners not designated for outside labor engaged in maintenance, cleaning, or camp service duties. The midday meal was eaten either in the field or the camp, depending on the job location. Work concluded in the late afternoon, after which prisoners returned to their compounds for evening roll call, supper, and recreation. Lights out was usually enforced between 9:30 and 10 p.m. Free time in the camps was limited but structured. Prisoners were encouraged to participate in sports, crafts, and educational classes during non-working hours. These activities were not merely recreational. They served administrative purposes by preventing restlessness and maintaining discipline. Soccer was the dominant sport, followed by volleyball, boxing, and table tennis. Many camps organized internal leagues with scheduled matches and formal scorekeeping. Cultural programs were an important aspect of daily life. German officers and educated prisoners organized lectures on engineering, history, and language. The YMCA and Red Cross supplied books and educational materials, allowing prisoners to continue studies interrupted by the war. In several camps, prisoners published handwritten newsletters containing factual updates, poetry, and art. These were reviewed by censors, but provided an outlet for communication and creativity. Music and theater flourished in the larger camps. The U.S. Army permitted concerts, plays, and even small orchestras. Instruments were obtained through donations or Red Cross channels. Prisoner musicians performed classical works by Beethoven and Brahms, as well as German folk songs. Theatrical performances often depicted neutral or historical themes approved by American officials. These events were attended by both prisoners and guards. contributing to a more cooperative atmosphere. Religious observance continued as part of camp routine. Sunday services were held in designated chapels or barracks. German chaplains, supervised by U.S. Army clergy, conducted worship in German. Attendance was voluntary but typically high. Religious holidays such as Christmas and Easter were observed with modest celebrations, and special meals were arranged when possible. Discipline during work and daily routines remained firm. The U.S. Army required punctuality, cleanliness, and respect for authority. Minor infractions, such as lateness or failure to maintain equipment, resulted in temporary confinement or loss of privileges. Serious offenses, including attempts to escape or sabotage work, were rare but dealt with through military courts. Reports from 1943 to 1945 show that less than 1% of prisoners committed significant disciplinary violations, reflecting overall orderliness. Escape attempts occurred occasionally, but were not a major issue. The geographic isolation of most camps made success unlikely. Some prisoners attempted to flee in search of freedom rather than hostility, but nearly all were recaptured. The official policy dictated that escaped prisoners be returned without excessive punishment, though repeat offenders faced solitary confinement. Recreation and relative comfort led to growing contrasts between prisoners' lives and the hardships of civilians in wartime Europe. Letters sent through Red Cross channels often described abundant food and fair treatment, surprising families who expected suffering. The U.S. government allowed this correspondence, believing it demonstrated adherence to international law and possibly undermined Nazi propaganda. A notable feature of daily life was the interaction between prisoners and American civilians during work assignments. Farmers, factory owners, and local officials gradually developed working relationships with POW laborers. Many reported that the Germans were disciplined, efficient, and courteous. Although direct socialization outside work was forbidden, mutual respect often developed. In rural communities, this interaction softened earlier fears about the presence of enemy soldiers. Some camps introduced educational programs sponsored by the War Department's Special Projects Division, beginning in 1944. These initiatives, designed to expose prisoners to democratic ideas, included lectures on American history, political systems, and civic responsibility. Participation was voluntary but widely attended, as it provided intellectual stimulation and additional privileges. These programs would later evolve into formal re-education efforts during the post-war phase. Medical supervision continued to play an essential role in maintaining camp stability. Regular health inspections, vaccination schedules, and quarantine procedures prevented major outbreaks. Dietitians monitored nutritional balance, and physical fitness routines were encouraged to maintain labor readiness. Dental and optical services were available in larger camps. The internal social hierarchy of prisoners remained tied to military rank and background. Officers, who were not required to work, organized their own educational and cultural programs. Enlisted men, engaged in daily labor, still maintained military discipline within the barracks. The American command structure allowed this system to function as long as it did not interfere with camp administration. Material comforts, though modest, added to the sense of stability. Barracks were heated in winter, clothing was regularly laundered, and mail arrived with relative consistency. The canteens, stocked with cigarettes, candy, and small goods, became central meeting points. Compared to the conditions of the collapsing German home front, such amenities appeared luxurious. This perception contributed to the later accounts of prisoners describing their treatment as unexpectedly favorable. As 1945 approached, the structure of daily life in the camps remained steady, even as the war in Europe neared its end. Rumors of Germany's defeat circulated through newspapers, aloud in the camps. Prisoners debated future outcomes, and attitudes toward the Nazi regime continued to shift. However, camp discipline and schedules persisted until formal surrender orders reached U.S. authorities. The cumulative experience of steady work, plentiful food, structured recreation, and fair discipline led many German POWs to reassess their image of the United States. They had entered captivity expecting harsh treatment and deprivation. Instead, they encountered an organized system that provided stability, nutrition, and respect under military law. To men accustomed to rationing, constant danger, and political indoctrination, the American camps represented a surprising contrast. By the end of 1945, when repatriation discussions began, many prisoners openly expressed reluctance to return to a devastated Germany. Their time in captivity had introduced them to consistent order and material sufficiency unavailable in post-war Europe. For many, the daily life they experienced, the work programs, reliable meals, and access to education left a lasting impression that defined their view of America long after the war ended. As daily life in the American POW camps stabilized, U.S. military authorities recognized an opportunity to influence the ideological outlook of the German prisoners. The experience of consistent food, fair treatment, and structured discipline had already begun to erode many prisoners' expectations of hostility. By 1944, the War Department sought to expand this natural shift through a systematic effort to counter Nazi indoctrination and expose prisoners to democratic values. This initiative evolved into one of the earliest large-scale programs of ideological re-education conducted by the United States military. The foundation for this effort was laid by the Special Projects Division, SPD. Established under the Provost Marshal General's office in early 1944, the division's objective was to weaken Nazi influence within the POW population, promote understanding of democratic principles, and prepare the prisoners for constructive reintegration into post-war Germany. The SPD was led by Colonel Edward Davison, a scholar and military officer who believed that intellectual engagement and exposure to democratic institutions could produce long-term attitudinal change. Initial investigations revealed that ideological divisions already existed among the prisoners. While a minority remained committed to National Socialist ideology, many were ordinary soldiers motivated by duty rather than conviction. The SPD categorized the POW population into three broad groups: committed Nazis, black; undecided or passive followers, gray; and non-Nazis or anti-Nazis, white. This classification guided the strategy of separating the most fanatical prisoners to prevent them from dominating camp culture and intimidating moderates. To implement this policy, the Army relocated known Nazi activists to high-security facilities such as Camp Alva in Oklahoma and Fort Devens in Massachusetts. These camps held prisoners who maintained allegiance to Hitler and were identified through interrogations, reports from fellow inmates, or possession of propaganda material. By isolating these individuals, the War Department reduced ideological tension in the general camps and created a more neutral environment for educational programs. The re-education effort began with informational materials rather than direct instruction. In early 1944, the SPD introduced Der Ruf, The Call, a German-language newspaper edited by anti-Nazi German prisoners under U.S. supervision. Each issue contained factual news reports, discussions of democracy, and essays on culture, ethics, and reconstruction. The editors avoided overt propaganda and instead emphasized reasoned argument. Distribution of Der Ruf extended to over 100,000 copies monthly, reaching nearly every major POW camp in the United States. The paper became the most visible instrument of American re-education policy, Alongside Der Ruf, the SPD organized educational lectures, discussion groups, and film screenings designed to encourage critical thinking. American officers selected non-political themes that could gradually lead to broader discussions about government and responsibility. Topics included economics, civic organization, and the structure of the American political system. Films produced by the U.S. Office of War Information were shown in many camps, depicting life in the United States, industrial production, and democratic institutions. The goal was not coercion, but demonstration, to contrast the openness and stability of American society with the authoritarian control familiar to the prisoners. Psychological evaluation played a role in shaping the re-education strategy. The War Department employed psychologists and linguists, including German-speaking academics, to study prisoner attitudes. Surveys and interviews conducted in 1944 to 45 revealed that while a segment of prisoners still adhered to Nazi ideology, the majority were confused or disillusioned. Many reported that the conditions in the camps contradicted everything they had been told about Americans. This cognitive dissonance formed the psychological basis for gradual ideological change. The SPD also encouraged cultural exchange as a subtle method of influence. Musical performances, art exhibits, and literary discussions featuring both German and American themes were organized in larger camps. These events were monitored but not censored beyond security concerns. They offered prisoners a sense of respect and participation in cultural life, reinforcing the impression that the American system valued intellectual freedom rather than suppression. One of the central projects of the Reeducation Initiative was the Prisoner of War Special Projects School, established at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, in 1944. The school selected several hundred German prisoners identified as potential opinion leaders, teachers, officers, journalists, and professionals, who displayed willingness to reject National Socialism. The curriculum focused on political history, democratic governance, and moral responsibility. American instructors, often university professors fluent in German, conducted seminars that contrasted totalitarian and democratic principles through factual analysis rather than ideological pressure. Graduates of Fort Kearny were then transferred to other camps to serve as informal educators and discussion leaders among fellow prisoners. The American authorities exercised caution in labeling these activities re-education. Official documents referred to them as orientation or information programs, to avoid charges of forced indoctrination. Nonetheless, the intent was clear: to promote democratic values and prepare prisoners for participation in a post-war Germany that would be free from Nazi control. The effort reflected early recognition of the psychological dimensions of warfare and the importance of shaping perceptions through consistent behavior rather than coercion. The effectiveness of these programs depended heavily on the existing camp environment. Because prisoners already enjoyed stable food supplies, medical care, and fair treatment, they were more receptive to educational activities. The contrast between their current conditions and the deteriorating situation in Germany further weakened loyalty to the Nazi regime. Reports from the SPD in 1945 noted that enthusiasm for Hitler had diminished sharply, particularly after the Allied liberation of France and the collapse of the Eastern Front. A critical aspect of the psychological transition involved exposure to democratic process in daily camp administration. The system of elected prisoner spokesmen and committees, permitted under Geneva Convention provisions, gave the prisoners a limited form of self-governance. These committees managed camp discipline, sanitation, and recreational programs under supervision. The act of electing representatives and debating camp issues provided many Germans with their first practical experience of democratic participation. For a population accustomed to hierarchical command, this experience had lasting influence. Interrogation reports collected by the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Service, MIS, after 1945, confirmed this shift in perception. Many prisoners stated that their views of the United States had changed entirely as a result of their time in captivity. They cited fair treatment, open communication, and exposure to American education as reasons for reassessing their previous beliefs. Even among those who remained skeptical of Allied motives, respect for the order and consistency of the system was widespread. The process of denazification in the camps was not free of obstacles. Some prisoners resisted participation in lectures or boycotted Der Ruf, claiming it was Allied propaganda. In a few camps, hidden Nazi groups formed to intimidate moderates, but these were gradually dismantled through transfers and disciplinary measures. The War Department's separation policy and continued surveillance prevented such movements from regaining significant influence. By late 1944, camp records indicated a noticeable decline in ideological incidents. The Red Cross and neutral observers noted the educational programs during their inspections, but rarely objected, as the activities were voluntary and non-coercive. The Swiss government, acting as the protecting power for German interests, concluded that the U.S. treatment of POWs, including the Reeducation initiatives, remained within the bounds of international law. As Germany's defeat approached in early 1945, the tone of educational materials changed. Discussions shifted from abstract political theory to practical issues of reconstruction, civic responsibility, and reconciliation. Prisoners studied the structures of local government, trade unions, and civil administration. These sessions prepared them for reintegration into a post-Nazi society. Some prisoners even expressed interest in remaining in America after the war, to continue studying democratic systems firsthand. The psychological transformation of the POW population was documented through extensive post-war interviews. The U.S. Army's Historical Division conducted surveys in 1945 and 1946 to evaluate the results of the Reeducation program. Findings showed that a significant proportion of prisoners no longer identified as supporters of National Socialism. Many attributed their change of perspective to the combination of humane treatment and exposure to democratic ideals, rather than direct persuasion. This outcome was regarded as one of the most successful non-violent ideological programs of the war. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Der Ruf continued publication for several months, transitioning into a post-war version distributed in occupied Germany under Allied supervision. Former POW editors such as Alfred Anders and Hans-Werner Richter later became prominent figures in West German literature and journalism. Their experiences in the American POW Reeducation program influenced the early democratic and intellectual culture of post-war West Germany. The U.S. Reeducation initiative also served as a model for later occupation policies. The approach demonstrated that controlled exposure to democratic practices, supported by humane treatment, could yield ideological change more effectively than coercion. This philosophy informed subsequent American efforts in Germany during the Allied occupation, including the establishment of democratic institutions and media. Psychologically, captivity under the American system produced complex reactions among prisoners. While most expressed appreciation for fair treatment, some experienced guilt over living comfortably while their families suffered in Europe. This tension was documented in reports from camp chaplains and psychiatrists, who noted that prisoners often struggled to reconcile their good conditions with loyalty to their homeland. However, this internal conflict further weakened identification with the Nazi regime, which they came to associate with the destruction of their country. The long-term consequences of these programs became evident after repatriation. Studies conducted in the late 1940s by both U.S. and German researchers found that former POWs held in the United States were among the least hostile toward Americans and the most inclined to accept democratic governance. Many later participated in rebuilding efforts, joined civic organizations, and promoted reconciliation between the two nations. Their testimony reinforced the idea that the combination of humane policy and educational exposure could transform adversaries into cooperative partners. By the end of 1945, the American Reeducation and Psychological Orientation Program had achieved its operational goals. Nazi influence within the POW population was reduced. Democratic values were introduced, and a foundation for post-war cooperation was established. The transformation from ideological enemies to pragmatic observers of democracy represented a significant achievement in wartime psychological operations. The process did not rely on propaganda or coercion, but on consistent policy, respect for human dignity, and exposure to functioning democratic institutions. For the German prisoners who experienced it, the lessons learned in captivity often proved more enduring than any formal instruction. Many carried those impressions back to Germany, contributing to the cultural and political evolution of the new democratic state that would emerge in the years following the war. By mid-1945, the collapse of Nazi Germany brought the primary purpose of the American POW system to an end. The surrender of German forces in May left over 370,000 German prisoners of war held in camps across the United States. The War Department faced the logistical and diplomatic task of repatriating them to a country that no longer existed in its previous political form. This phase, stretching from 1945 to 1946, marked a transition from wartime containment to post-war management, shaped by international law, Allied policy, and the unexpected reluctance of many prisoners to return home. The legal framework for repatriation was governed by the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War, which required the release and return of POWs without delay after the conclusion of peace. However, the situation in 1945 was complicated by Germany's unconditional surrender and the absence of a functioning German government. The Allied powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, assumed collective responsibility for German prisoners, and their differing priorities created delays in the process. The U.S. military's Provost Marshal General's Office, PMGO, coordinated the initial repatriation schedule. Early plans called for phased returns beginning in the summer of 1945, prioritizing wounded and long-held prisoners. But labor shortages in Europe and post-war reconstruction needs led to new directives. At the request of Britain and France, large numbers of German POWs were transferred from the United States to Europe to serve as laborers in rebuilding war-torn infrastructure and agriculture. This loan of manpower postponed the full repatriation of many prisoners, despite the official end of hostilities. Between June and December 1945, approximately 135,000 German POWs were shipped from American ports, primarily New York, Norfolk, and New Orleans, to Great Britain and France. These transfers were organized under agreements within the Allied Expeditionary Force and were justified as contributions to European recovery. Many of these men, who had spent years in relative comfort in the United States, found the working conditions in European labor camps drastically different. Reports from the International Red Cross documented instances of overcrowding, poor nutrition, and harsh weather exposure in French and British labor battalions. The contrast reinforced the prisoners' perception of American captivity as humane and disciplined. For those still in American camps, the uncertainty surrounding repatriation created both anxiety and hesitation. Army surveys from 1945 recorded that a substantial portion of German prisoners expressed a desire to remain in the United States temporarily or permanently. They feared returning to a devastated homeland marked by famine, destruction, and occupation. Many had received letters from relatives describing ruined cities and shortages of basic supplies. Camp chaplains and Red Cross representatives reported that some prisoners wept openly when informed that they would soon be shipped home. The administrative process of repatriation was complex. Camps were gradually consolidated as prisoners were moved closer to major ports. Facilities in Texas, Louisiana, and the Carolinas became staging centers where POWs underwent medical examinations, received updated identification documents, and attended brief orientation lectures about post-war Germany. The War Department issued them standard travel rations and small allowances in German currency. Military police escorted them to embarkation points under strict supervision, though discipline problems remained rare. Transportation was primarily conducted by Liberty and Victory-class ships repurposed for troop and POW movement. Each vessel carried between 2,000 and 3,000 prisoners, guarded by small detachments of U.S. military personnel. The voyages to Europe typically lasted 10 to 12 days. Conditions aboard were regulated by international standards, with daily meals, sanitation facilities, and limited deck access for exercise. Shipboard logs from the period record only minor disciplinary incidents and note that many prisoners spent the journey discussing the situation awaiting them in Germany. Upon arrival in Europe, repatriated POWs were processed through Allied-controlled ports such as Le Havre, Cherbourg, and Southampton before being assigned to either labor service or repatriation camps inside occupied Germany. The division of labor among the Allies meant that a significant proportion of former U.S.-held prisoners were turned over to British and French authorities before reaching German soil. Many were placed in agricultural or construction units, rebuilding bridges, roads, and railways. American officials justified these transfers as temporary and necessary for European recovery, though they effectively prolonged captivity for tens of thousands of men. For the majority who returned directly to Germany, reintegration proved difficult. Allied occupation authorities, including the U.S. Office of Military Government, OMGUS, documented widespread disorientation among returning POWs. Many had been absent for years and returned to find families displaced, homes destroyed, and cities reduced to rubble. The material contrast between the organized, well-supplied American camps and the devastated German landscape was profound. The experience contributed to the widespread narrative among former prisoners that they had lived better in captivity than in freedom. The psychological effects of this reversal were significant. Post-war German social researchers later identified returning POWs as a distinct group with complex attitudes toward both the United States and the Nazi past. They tended to be less nationalistic, more pragmatic, and often skeptical of authoritarian ideology. Many credited their exposure to democratic practices in American camps for shaping their post-war outlook. This disposition made them important contributors to the political stabilization of West Germany in the late 1940s. American policymakers observed these developments closely. The U.S. Army's Historical Division and the War Department's Prisoner of War Division compiled reports analyzing the behavior and attitudes of returning POWs. These studies concluded that the humane treatment policy had yielded significant long-term benefits, reducing hostility and fostering positive views of American governance. The findings influenced subsequent U.S. policies toward occupied populations and became a reference point during the formation of the Marshall Plan. Meanwhile, the logistics of demobilization within the United States accelerated. By March 1946, only about 40,000 German POWs remained on American soil. The last major repatriation convoy departed in June 1946, marking the formal end of the POW program in the continental United States. The War Department reported that fewer than 1,500 prisoners remained in special status. Primarily hospital patients, witnesses in war crimes investigations, or volunteers for additional service in Europe. The human element of this transition was recorded in letters and diaries collected by both American officers and post-war historians. Many German prisoners described their final weeks in the United States with mixed emotions. They had developed relationships with American civilians, especially through farm labor programs in the Midwest and South. Local families often expressed gratitude for their work and treated them as guests rather than captives. Farewell gatherings were common, and in some communities, local newspapers documented residents saying goodbye to the departing Germans. These interactions contributed to the enduring image of the POWs being treated like kings. After repatriation, a notable number of former POWs sought to return to the United States legally. Beginning in the late 1940s, immigration records show a steady stream of ex-prisoners applying for visas under agricultural or skilled labor programs. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 and subsequent immigration legislation facilitated their entry. By the early 1950s, thousands of former German POWs had resettled in America, often in the same regions where they had once labored under supervision. Oral histories collected decades later reveal that these men viewed their wartime captivity as a turning point that altered their understanding of freedom, responsibility, and political authority. The contrast between American and Soviet handling of POWs reinforced these sentiments. Many former prisoners learned, after returning home, of the harsh conditions endured by compatriots held in the Soviet Union, where hundreds of thousands remained in forced labor until the early 1950s. The comparative experience further elevated the reputation of American treatment and contributed to pro-Western sentiment among the repatriated population. Allied occupation officials noted that former U.S.-held POWs adapted more quickly to democratic institutions and were less susceptible to extremist political movements in post-war Germany. Repatriation also influenced the reconstruction of German society in subtle ways. Several former POWs who had participated in the U.S. Reeducation programs later assumed roles in local government, education, and journalism. Their exposure to democratic ideas, fair administration, and freedom of expression became part of the intellectual foundation of the emerging Federal Republic of Germany in 1949. Scholars such as Alfred Anders, Hans Werner Richter, and Walter Kolb acknowledged the formative influence of their captivity in shaping their post-war commitments to democracy and civic reform. American officials recognized these outcomes as evidence of the effectiveness of humane policy. Reports from the U.S. State Department and War Department in the late 1940s described the POW program as an unintended success in democratic reorientation. The positive attitudes of returning prisoners helped counter anti-American propaganda in occupied Europe and fostered early reconciliation between former enemies. This experience became part of the intellectual foundation for post-war American foreign policy, emphasizing rehabilitation and partnership over retribution. Statistically, the repatriation process concluded more smoothly than anticipated. By September 1946, over 95% of German POWs once held in the United States had been returned or transferred to European custody. The final administrative closures occurred in early 1947, when the last hospital cases were released. U.S. military documentation recorded minimal disciplinary issues during the entire repatriation process, reflecting the discipline and organization instilled during years of structured captivity. The long-term memory of these events persisted well into the post-war decades. Reunions between former POWs and American civilians who had employed them became common in the 1950s and 1960s. Correspondence archives in states such as Texas, Iowa, and Georgia contain hundreds of letters exchanged between ex-prisoners and American families. Many visitors returned to the United States as tourists, revisiting the towns and farms where they had once worked. These interactions symbolized a reconciliation process rooted not in diplomacy, but in personal experience. The U.S. handling of German POWs also became a case study in military ethics and international relations. Post-war analyses by the Army War College and the Judge Advocate General's Corps cited it as an example of successful adherence to international law combined with strategic psychological benefit. The program demonstrated that humane treatment could serve both moral and practical objectives, producing compliance, discipline, and eventual goodwill. By the time the last transports departed American shores, the transformation of German prisoners was complete. The men who had once expected brutality had encountered order, respect, and education. The repatriation process closed a unique chapter in wartime history, one in which the United States applied international law not merely as an obligation, but as a strategic principle. The legacy of this policy extended beyond the immediate post-war years, influencing both the reconstruction of Germany and the broader framework of Western alliance. For many former prisoners, the experience reshaped their personal identities. Oral testimonies collected by historians such as Arnold Kramer and Jürgen Rover describe a consistent pattern: initial disbelief upon capture, gradual adjustment to American discipline, and eventual appreciation for the fairness of the system. These accounts, corroborated by U.S. Army records, provide a factual basis for the enduring observation that German POWs in America were shocked to be treated like kings. The sentiment was not metaphorical, but grounded in comparative reality. The difference between Nazi totalitarianism, wartime devastation, and the structured humanity of American custody. The repatriation of German prisoners thus represented not only a logistical success, but a profound human transition. When they boarded ships back to Europe, many carried memories of order, civility, and equality that contrasted sharply with the ruin awaiting them. In later decades, as West Germany emerged as a democratic ally of the United States, the attitudes formed in these camps contributed silently but meaningfully to the transatlantic partnership that defined the post-war world.